GDP or Gross Domestic Product is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's border in a specific period of time. GDP provides an economic snapshot of a country as it is an accurate measurement to analyze the country's economic health. For example, it is used to estimate the size of an economy and its growth rate. Moreover, GDP usually computed annually or quarterly depending on that country. GDP can be calculated in two ways, which are expenditure approach and income approach.
Methods of measuring national income. First, expenditure approach. The total value of goods and services, GDP, is calculated by adding the expenditure on them across the four different economic sectors, which are consumption, investment, government, and net exports. This approach comprises four components. First, personal consumption expenditure, C, can be referred to as all expenditures by households on durable consumer goods, non-durable consumer goods, and consumer expenditures for services. It is also known as private consumption. Next, I, gross private domestic investment. A common term used in economics refers to the purchase of new capital by firms, such as housing, plants, equipment, and inventory. Gross private domestic investment comprises three components, which are non-residential investment, residential investment, and change in business inventories. For the next component, which are government expenditure, G, or government spending. It refers to the expenditure incurred by federal, state, and local governments for final goods and services. This expenditure consists of two components, which are goods and services that government consume in providing public services, and social capital such as schools and highways, which have long-term lifetime. Last but not least, net export, which are X minus by M. Net export is the difference between the value of exports and the value of imports. In the expenditure approach, GDP is calculated by adding up all the four components of expenditure, which is GDP equal to C plus I plus G plus NX.
Next, the other way to calculate GDP is to use the income approach. This approach allocates expenditures as income to those responsible for producing the output. The income approach uses different inputs from the expenditure approach. The major components for this approach are national income, which is made up of employee compensation, rents, interest, proprietor income, corporate profits, and taxes on production and imports. For your information, under the income approach, all expenditures on final goods and services flow as income to either private citizen or the government. Moreover, several adjustments must be made to move from national income to GDP. The adjustment consists of three items. The items are net foreign factor income, statistical discrepancy, and consumption of fixed capital.
We all know that GDP is a tool to measure economic welfare and economic growth in a nation. But when we want to compare our GDP with other countries' GDP, there are two issues arise. The first one is the GDP of a country is measured in its own currency. For example, like in the United States, they use US dollar, and in Japan, they use yen. And in Malaysia, we use ringgit Malaysia. So when we want to compare GDP between two countries, we need to convert the currency to a common currency. Next, the second issue arise is that the country have very different numbers of people. For instance, the United States has a much larger economy than Canada, but it also have roughly 9 times as many people as Canada. When we try to compare their GDP, we need to divide GDP by population first.
Gross domestic product per capita. GDP per capita measures a country's economic output that accounts for its number of people and can be calculated by dividing the GDP of a country by its population. GDP per capita is an important indicator of the economic performance of a country. It is also important to do comparison between countries for average living standard and economic well-being. A country that has a growing GDP per capita with a stable population level shows a country is producing with the same level of population level. Let us compare the GDP per capita in G20 countries, which is the United States, Germany and Japan in 2018. United States has the highest GDP per capita compared to the three countries, which is $62,996.47 with the population of 327.2 million people. This shows that average living standard and well-being of the United States are in a good condition. Followed by Germany GDP per capita, which is $47,810.51 with the population of 82.79 million of people. Japan has the lowest GDP per capita among the three countries, which is $39,159 with the population of 126.5 million people. Next is the comparison of the GDP per capita in OIC countries, which is Malaysia, Brunei and United Arab Emirates in 2018. UAE have the highest GDP per capita compared to the three countries, which is $43,839 with a population of 9.631 million people. This shows that average living standard and well-being of the UAE are in a good state. Followed by Brunei GDP per capita, which is $31,628.33 with the population of 428,962 people. Malaysia has the lowest GDP per capita among the three countries, which is $11,373.23 with the population of 31.53 million people.
GDP is important because it gives information about the size of the economy and how an economy is performing. The growth rate of real GDP is often used as an indicator of the general health of the economy. In broad terms, an increase in real GDP is interpreted as a sign that the economy is doing well. When real GDP is growing strongly, employment is likely to be increasing as companies hire more workers for their factories and people have more money in their pockets. When GDP is shrinking, as it did in many countries during the recent global economic crisis, employment often declines. In some cases, GDP may be growing but not fast enough to create a sufficient number of jobs for those seeking them. But real GDP growth does move in cycles over time. Economies are sometimes in period of boom and sometimes in period of slow growth or even recession. For example, in the United States, there were 6 recessions of varying length and severity between 2050 and 2011. The National Bureau of Economic Research makes the call on the days of US business cycles.